You know, I'd always dreamed of wide open spaces. Not just a big backyard, mind you, but proper land. Land where you could hear the wind rustle through trees instead of traffic, where the stars weren't just faint smudges in a polluted sky, and where the closest thing to a nosy neighbor was a curious deer peeking through the foliage. After a lifetime of city bustle, saving every spare dime, and more than a few sacrifices, I finally did it. I bought myself a little slice of heaven, a 20-acre ranch, a bit rundown but with good bones and even better soil, nestled just far enough from civilization to feel remote, but close enough for groceries. It was perfect. The old farmhouse needed work, the fences were sagging, and the barn had seen better decades, but it was mine. All mine. I envisioned mornings with coffee on the porch watching the sunrise paint the fields gold, afternoons spent tending to a small vegetable garden and maybe a few chickens, evenings listening to the crickets. Simple pleasures, the kind that money can't truly buy, but the kind my hard-earned money had finally secured for me. My son, Michael, was thrilled for me. He's a good boy, always has been. Works as a police officer in the county, a tough job but he handles it with a maturity that still surprises me sometimes. He'd come out on weekends before the sale closed, walking the property with me, his eyes lighting up almost as much as mine. "Mom, this is incredible," he'd said, kicking at a loose clod of dirt. "You deserve this," and I believed him. I did deserve it. The first few weeks were bliss. Pure, unadulterated, dusty, sweaty, tiring bliss. I was up with the dawn, clearing brush, patching up the most urgent bits of the house, planning where the chicken coop would go. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a perfume I'd craved for years. I'd unpack another box, find a place for some cherished old belonging, and feel another piece of my new life click into place. The silence at night was profound, broken only by the hoot of an owl or the distant yip of a coyote. I even started to get to know some of the other folks in the area, a friendly wave from a passing truck, a quick chat at the feed store. It was everything I'd hoped for. Except, as it often happens when things seem too good to be true, there was a fly in the ointment. Or in my case, a perfectly coiffed, terrifyingly perky woman who seemed to materialize out of nowhere on my third Saturday, clipboard in hand, a frown etched permanently onto her face. I was wrestling with a particularly stubborn fence post, sweat dripping down my brow, covered in mud and probably looking like I'd been wrestling a pig, when she cleared her throat. It was a sound like gravel being ground under a sensible heel. I straightened up, wiping my forehead with the back of a dirty glove, and saw her standing there, just inside my property line, though I hadn't heard a car. She was dressed in crisp linen slacks and a blouse that probably cost more than my entire week's grocery budget, a stark contrast to my own disheveled state. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep the surprise out of my voice. Her eyes, a pale, assessing blue, flicked over me, then around the yard, lingering on the pile of old lumber I was planning to haul away. "Yes," she said, her voice high and tight. "I'm Brenda Higgins, president of the Meadowview Ranch Estates Homeowners Association." My heart sank a little. HOA. I knew there was one, of course, it was in the paperwork. But the realtor had made it sound very laid back, mostly concerned with road maintenance and ensuring nobody set up a junkyard. This woman did not look laid back. She looked like she ironed her socks. "Oh, hello," I said, trying for friendly. "Sarah Miller." "I just moved in." "Yes, we're aware," she replied, as if my arrival was a problematic agenda item. "And frankly, Mrs. Miller, the board is already concerned. I'd barely had time to unpack my toothbrush, let alone cause any concern. "Concerned about what, exactly?" I asked, a tiny prickle of defensiveness starting to bloom. She tapped her clipboard with a perfectly manicured nail. "Well, for starters, the general state of upkeep. This property has been an eyesore for some time, and while we had hoped a new owner would bring immediate improvements, what we're seeing so far is more of the same. Debris, unkempt landscaping." She gestured vaguely at the very pile of lumber I was in the process of dealing with. I bit back the urge to tell her that Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither was a restored ranch. "I've only been here 3 weeks, Miss Higgins," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "And I'm working on it." As you can see, I indicated the new post I'd just managed to set. She sniffed. "The bylaws are quite clear regarding property maintenance standards. And visible storage of building materials. And unapproved exterior modifications, my mind reeled. Unapproved exterior modifications. I hadn't modified anything yet, just tried to stop a fence from collapsing entirely. This was not the welcome I'd envisioned. The dream of peaceful ranch life suddenly had a very annoying, very persistent buzzing sound attached to it, and its name was Brenda Higgins. I had a feeling this was only the beginning, and that feeling, unfortunately, turned out to be spot on. The clipboard, I would soon learn, was her weapon of choice, and she wielded it with the precision of a seasoned duelist. Little did she know, I wasn't one to back down from a fight, especially when it came to my own home, my own hard-won peace. This was my ranch, and no HOA president, no matter how persnickety, was going to bully me out of enjoying it or dictate every blade of grass. The initial encounter with Brenda Higgins was merely the opening salvo in what quickly became a campaign of petty tyranny. She seemed to have an uncanny ability to appear whenever I was in the middle of some particularly messy or strenuous task, always with a fresh complaint or a friendly reminder about some obscure bylaw I was supposedly violating. One day it was the color I was considering for the porch railings. Apparently, heritage white was acceptable, but the country cream I'd picked out was too yellow and out of character with the community aesthetic. The community aesthetic, as far as I could tell, was a hodgepodge of different styles, but Brenda spoke of it as if it were a sacred, monolithic entity. Another time, it was the placement of my compost bin. Too visible from the road, she claimed, even though the road was a good 100 yards away and screened by a line of trees I was planning to thicken. I even got a notice about unregulated livestock, because I mentioned to the chatty fellow at the feed store that I was thinking about getting half a dozen chickens for eggs. Apparently, I needed to submit a detailed plan, including coop design, waste disposal methods, and a notarized statement that my chickens wouldn't engage in excessive crowing, a difficult promise to extract from a chicken, I imagine. It felt like I was living under a microscope, every action scrutinized, every plan preemptively criticized. The joy of those first few weeks began to curdle into a constant, low-grade anxiety. I'd find myself looking over my shoulder before hammering a nail, wondering if Brenda was lurking behind a bush with her clipboard and a fresh violation notice. I started talking to Michael about it more, not to complain excessively, but just to vent and get his perspective. He'd listen patiently, his brow furrowed. "Mom, this sounds like harassment," he said one evening after I recounted the compost bin incident. "HOAs have rules, sure, but there's a line between enforcing reasonable covenants and just being a power-tripping bully." "That's Brenda in a nutshell," I sighed, stirring my tea. Power-tripping bully with a laminated copy of the bylaws and too much time on her hands. "You need to document everything," he advised, his cop brain kicking in. "Dates, times, what she said, what you said. Take pictures of these supposed violations. Keep copies of all the notices. If she's really overstepping, a paper trail is your best defense." It was good advice, and I started taking it immediately. I bought a notebook specifically for the Brenda Chronicles, as I grimly dubbed it in my head. I took photos of my perfectly reasonable compost bin, its offensive visibility, or lack thereof. I saved every passive-aggressive email and every formally typed, vaguely threatening letter that arrived bearing the Meadowview Ranch Estates HOA letterhead. It was a depressing collection, but Michael was right. If this escalated, I needed proof that I wasn't the problem here. I also spent a few evenings poring over the HOA documents myself. They were as dense and uninspiring as you'd expect, full of legalese and stipulations about everything from mailbox design to the maximum allowable height of a hedge. What I found was that many of the rules were indeed vaguely worded, open to interpretation. And Brenda, it seemed, always chose the interpretation that was most restrictive and most inconvenient for me. There were clauses about maintaining property, in good order and repair, but no objective definition of what that meant, allowing her to deem my ongoing renovation efforts as a perpetual state of disarray. There was mention of harmonious exterior appearances, another subjective minefield. The thing that really brought matters to a head, though, was the fence. The existing perimeter fence was a patchwork of rotting posts, rusted wire, and hopeful thinking. It wouldn't keep a determined snail in, let alone the small herd of rescue goats I was dreaming of. Repairing and replacing it was high on my priority list, not just for aesthetics but for safety and practicality. I researched the HOA bylaws regarding fences very carefully. They specified height restrictions, no more than 5 feet, and material guidelines, wood or other customary ranch-style materials, nothing about pre-approval for repairs or replacements of existing structures, especially if they met the guidelines. So, I ordered the materials, sturdy wooden posts, good quality wire mesh, everything well within the HOA's written rules. The delivery truck arrived on a bright Tuesday morning, and the driver had barely started unloading when Brenda's car, a pristine white SUV that always looked freshly detailed, crunched up my gravel driveway. She emerged, sunglasses perched on her head, that infernal clipboard already in her grasp. "Mrs. Miller," she called out, her voice sharp enough to curdle milk. "What is all this?" I walked over, trying to keep my expression neutral. "It's fencing material, Miss Higgins. For the perimeter fence. As you can see," I gestured to a particularly dilapidated section, "it's in desperate need of replacement." Her eyes narrowed. "And have you submitted your plans to the Architectural Review Committee for approval?" I blinked. The bylaws state that fences must be under 5 feet and made of wood or customary ranch materials. These materials meet those requirements. There's no mention of pre-approval for replacing an existing, compliant fence structure with another compliant 1-inch. This was a point I had double-checked. "All modifications require approval," she insisted, tapping her clipboard emphatically. "That fence is a significant modification. It's a replacement, a repair to bring it up to standard," I countered, my patience wearing thin. "It's exactly the kind of improvement the HOA should be encouraging, isn't it? Maintaining property values." Brenda puffed up slightly. "The committee has a process, Mrs. Miller. You can't just unilaterally decide to erect new structures." "I'm not erecting a new structure in that sense, I'm replacing an old, failing one on the exact same footprint with approved materials," I said, trying to enunciate clearly, as if speaking to a child. "Frankly, your interpretation seems designed to be obstructive. That was probably a mistake." Her lips thinned. "If you proceed without approval, Mrs. Miller, the HOA will have no choice but to issue a stop work order and daily fines until the unapproved structure is removed. And if necessary, we will arrange for its removal at your expense." The sheer audacity of it took my breath away. She was threatening to tear down a brand new, perfectly good fence that complied with her own written rules, simply because I hadn't kowtowed to her unwritten demand for a special review. This wasn't about bylaws, this was about power. Her power. I looked at the pile of beautiful new posts, the rolls of shiny wire, then back at Brenda's smug face. And something inside me snapped. Not in a loud way, but in a quiet, firm, unyielding way. "Ms. Higgins," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I have read the bylaws. I am complying with the bylaws. I am improving my property in accordance with the bylaws. This fence is going up. If you wish to pursue fines or try to remove it, I suggest you consult with an attorney first, because I will fight you every step of the way." Her jaw dropped slightly, just for a second, before her expression hardened again. "You'll be hearing from our legal counsel, Mrs. Miller." "I look forward to it," I replied, turning my back on her and addressing the delivery driver. "Right, where did you want to start unloading these posts?" The driver, who had been watching this exchange with wide eyes, quickly got back to work. Brenda stood there for another minute, fuming, then spun on her heel, got into her SUV, and drove off, spraying a little more gravel than strictly necessary. The battle lines, it seemed, had been well and truly drawn, right along the path of my new fence. And I was damn well going to build it. The fence construction became my personal act of defiance. Every post I pounded into the earth, every stretch of wire I tightened, felt like a small victory against Brenda's petty authoritarianism. It was hard work, especially doing most of it myself, though Michael came out one weekend and helped me with some of the heavier lifting, his strong arms making short work of tasks that took me twice as long. He listened to the latest installment of the Brenda saga with a grim expression. "She actually threatened to have it torn down. After you told her it was compliant." "She did," I confirmed, wiping sweat from my brow. "Said I'd be hearing from their legal counsel." "Let them," Michael said, citing down a line of posts we'd just set. "Most HOA legal threats are just bluster, especially when they're in the wrong. They count on people getting scared and backing down. Don't you dare back down, Mom." His support was a balm to my frayed nerves. It wasn't just about the fence anymore, it was about the principle. It was about not letting someone like Brenda Higgins dictate my life and ruin the peace I'd worked so hard to find. I made sure to take copious photographs of the old, dilapidated fence before I removed each section, and then equally detailed photos of the new fence going up, documenting its height, materials, and placement. My Brenda Chronicles notebook was getting thicker. Sure enough, a few days after my confrontation with Brenda, a letter arrived. It was on impressive-looking letterhead from a law firm, full of whereas es and heretofores, essentially repeating Brenda's threats: cease and desist construction, remove the unapproved fence, or face daily fines and legal action to compel removal at my expense. It was designed to be intimidating, and I'll admit, it gave me a flutter of anxiety. But then I reread the actual HOA bylaws I had, compared them to the letter's claims, and the anxiety was replaced by a simmering anger. The letter was misrepresenting the bylaws, twisting vague clauses to suit Brenda's narrative. They were counting on me not knowing my rights, or not being willing to fight. I sat down and drafted a polite but firm response, referencing the specific bylaw sections that supported my position, pointing out that the fence was a replacement, not a new build in an unapproved location, and that the materials and height were fully compliant. I stated that I would not be ceasing construction, nor would I be removing the fence. I also enclosed copies of my photos of the old fence and the new one, clearly showing the like-for-like replacement with compliant materials. I sent it certified mail, return receipt requested, just like Michael taught me. The fence went up, section by glorious section. It looked fantastic, straight, sturdy, and perfectly in keeping with a rural ranch aesthetic. I even started to imagine my future goats happily grazing behind it. The daily fines started arriving in the mail, little slips of paper demanding $50 per day for the unapproved structure. I filed them neatly in my Brenda folder, right next to my copy of the response letter to their lawyer. I wasn't paying a dime. Let them take me to court, I had my documentation. The peace of the ranch, however, was definitely shattered. I found myself constantly on edge, waiting for the next escalation. Brenda took to driving slowly past my property several times a day, her gaze fixed on the new fence, her disapproval radiating like heat waves from asphalt. Sometimes she'd stop at the end of my drive, just sit there in her car for a few minutes, then drive off. It was unnerving, a deliberate act of intimidation. Then came the first call to the police. I was out in the barn one late afternoon, sorting through some old tools left by the previous owner. It was about 4 p.m., well within any reasonable hours for making a bit of noise. I might have dropped a metal bucket, which probably made a clang, but nothing excessive. Suddenly, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel again, but this time it wasn't Brenda's SUV. It was a county sheriff's car. 2 deputies got out, looking serious. My heart leaped into my throat. "Ma'am, are you Sarah Miller?" one of them asked, his hand resting near his sidearm. "Yes, I am," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is there a problem, officers?" "We received a call about a disturbance," the other deputy said, looking around. "Loud noises, possibly some sort of altercation, a disturbance." "An altercation?" I was alone on my property, sorting tools. I was just in the barn," I said, gesturing. "I might have dropped something, but an altercation. With whom?" The first deputy looked at his notepad. The call came from a Ms. Brenda Higgins. She reported shouting and loud banging, and was concerned for your welfare, and, the peace of the neighborhood, Brenda. Of course, it was Brenda. Concerned for my welfare? That was a laugh. She was trying to use the police to harass me. I felt a flush of anger and humiliation. "Officers," I said, taking a deep breath to calm myself. "Ms. Higgins is the president of the local HOA, and she and I have had some disagreements, primarily about a fence I recently installed. A fence she doesn't approve of, even though it meets all the bylaws. She has been subjecting me to a campaign of harassment for weeks. There has been no shouting, no altercation. I am perfectly fine, and I assure you, the only disturbance here is Ms. Higgins' repeated interference in my life." The deputies exchanged a look. They'd probably seen this kind of neighborhood dispute before. They walked around a bit, looked in the barn, saw nothing amiss. They were polite but clearly just going through the motions. "Well, ma'am, everything seems quiet now," one of them said finally. "We'll make a note of your side of the story." "Thank you, officers," I said. "I appreciate you coming out, but I assure you, any future calls from Ms. Higgins regarding my property are likely to be baseless." As they drove away, I saw Brenda's white SUV parked down the road, just far enough away to be inconspicuous, but close enough for her to have seen the police car at my house. She pulled away slowly as soon as the deputies left. The gloating was almost palpable, even from a distance. This was a new low. She was now willing to waste police resources to try and intimidate me. The fence was one thing, but involving the police like this, with false claims, that felt different. More serious. More malicious. I went inside, my hand shaking slightly, and immediately called Michael. I told him everything. He was silent for a long moment after I finished. Then he said, his voice hard, "Okay, Mom. This has gone far enough. She's filing false reports now. That's a crime." The word crime hung in the air. It was one thing to be a petty tyrant with a clipboard, it was another to be actively breaking the law. My determination to fight this, to not let her win, solidified into something like iron. This wasn't just about my peace anymore, it was about stopping a bully who thought she was above the law. Michael was furious, not just as my son, but as a police officer. "She's tying up resources, Mom. Deputies have better things to do than respond to her vendettas. Filing a false police report is a serious offense. People can get arrested for that." His words, while stark, were also strangely reassuring. It meant that Brenda wasn't untouchable, that her actions had real-world consequences beyond just annoying me. "So, what do I do?" I asked him, feeling a bit overwhelmed by the escalation. "Keep doing what you're doing," he said. "Document this. Write down exactly what happened, what the deputy said, the fact that you saw Brenda watching. If she does it again, and she probably will, knowing her type, call the non-emergency line yourself and report her for harassment and potentially for filing false reports. Create your own paper trail with the department." He paused, then added, "I'm going to do a little quiet digging on Miss Higgins and the HOA. Nothing that crosses any lines, just public record stuff. See if there's a pattern of this kind of behavior with other residents, past or present. Sometimes these HOA bullies have a long history." I was hesitant. "Michael, I don't want you getting into any trouble because of this." "Don't worry, Mom," he said, his voice firm. "I know the rules. This is just background. And it might be helpful if this does end up in court over those ridiculous fence fines." He also gave me some specific advice on how to interact with officers if Brenda called them again. Stay calm. Be polite. Clearly state that you believe this is a retaliatory call from Ms. Higgins due to ongoing HOA disputes. Offer any evidence you have of her harassment. Ask them to document your statement thoroughly in their report. The more reports that show her making baseless claims, the stronger your case against her becomes." Then he said something that planted a seed of an idea, a tiny glimmer of a potential ace up my sleeve. "You know, I pick up shifts all over the county. Sometimes I'm on patrol out your way. Just something to keep in mind." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press, but the thought was there. What if, by some wild chance, Michael was the one to respond if Brenda pulled another stunt? The thought was almost too delicious to contemplate. In the following weeks, Brenda seemed to dial back the direct confrontations slightly, perhaps sensing she'd overplayed her hand with the first police call, or maybe she was waiting to see if the legal threats and fines would make me capitulate on the fence. The daily fine notices kept coming, piling up in my folder. I continued to ignore them. Instead, she seemed to resort to more subtle, almost stealthy forms of harassment. I'd find small, almost insignificant items moved in my yard, a garden gnome shifted a few inches, a decorative stone placed on my porch step that wasn't mine. Nothing overtly damaging, but unsettling. It was her way of saying, "I can still get to you. I can still trespass." I installed a couple of discreet security cameras, the kind that look like birdhouses, covering my driveway and the main work areas of the yard. Michael had suggested it, and it made me feel a little less vulnerable. I also started being more proactive in the community. I joined a local ranchers Facebook group, attended a farmer's market in the nearby town, and made a point of chatting with my actual neighbors, the ones who weren't Brenda. I wanted to establish myself as a reasonable, contributing member of the community, not the troublemaker Brenda was painting me as. I even found a couple of other residents in the Meadowview Ranch estates who, when they heard I was having issues with Brenda, rolled their eyes and shared their own stories of her overreach and petty tyrannies. One older gentleman, Mr. Henderson, who'd lived there for 20 years, told me Brenda had tried to fine him for the color of his mailbox, even though it had been the same color for over a decade before she even moved into the neighborhood and certainly before she became HOA president. "She gets a little taste of power and it goes straight to her head, that one," he'd grumbled. "Most of us just try to fly under her radar." It was small comfort, but it confirmed I wasn't alone in finding her behavior unreasonable. Michael's quiet research also turned up a few interesting nuggets. There had been several other disputes that had escalated to lawyers' letters under Brenda's presidency, mostly with new residents, and in a couple of cases, the residents had simply given up and moved. It seemed Brenda had a pattern of targeting newcomers, perhaps seeing them as easier to intimidate. He also found out that the HOA's legal counsel was a small, local firm that seemed to specialize in boilerplate HOA demand letters, not complex litigation. This suggested their threats might indeed be more bluster than bite, designed to scare people into compliance rather than actually withstand rigorous legal scrutiny in court. All this information, my documentation, the camera footage, which showed Brenda's car driving by far more often than was natural, the stories from other residents, Michael's research, was building a picture. A picture of a woman abusing her position, engaging in a pattern of harassment, and potentially misusing HOA funds on legal actions that were more about personal vendettas than legitimate covenant enforcement. The stage was slowly being set, though I didn't know it at the time, for a much more direct confrontation, one where Brenda's overconfidence would finally, spectacularly, backfire. And my quiet, unassuming son would play a role I hadn't dared to hope for. The relative quiet from Brenda felt like the calm before a storm, and I braced myself for whatever her next move would be. I suspected it would be something designed to be far more damaging than a complaint about a fence or a dropped bucket. Brenda's next move, when it came, was indeed more insidious and potentially far more damaging. It arrived not via a clipboard or a drive-by glaring, but in a thick, official-looking envelope delivered by certified mail. My stomach clenched as I signed for it. Inside was a multi-page letter, not from the HOA's usual lawyer, but from a different firm, one with a more imposing letterhead. The tone was dramatically escalated. It accused me of a litany of new, more serious violations. Apparently, my small flock of 6 perfectly healthy, happy chickens, now clucking contentedly in their new, secure coop, built well away from property lines and meticulously cleaned daily, constituted an unauthorized commercial agricultural operation, my vegetable garden, from which I hoped to get some fresh produce for myself and maybe trade a few tomatoes with neighbors, was described as exceeding permissible hobby gardening limits and indicating intent for commercial sales, which was utterly preposterous. But the worst accusation, the one that made my blood boil, was a veiled insinuation of animal neglect. It vaguely mentioned concerns about the welfare of animals on my property, citing unconfirmed reports, and the general unkempt nature of the facilities, this, despite my animals being my top priority, receiving the best care I could provide. My little rescue dog, Daisy, was spoiled rotten, and the chickens had a veritable palace of a coop. I was planning on getting those rescue goats soon, and the thought that she would try to preemptively tarnish my reputation as an animal caregiver was infuriating. The letter stated that if these serious breaches were not rectified within 10 days, which meant, in her mind, getting rid of my chickens and probably my garden, the HOA would not only pursue legal action for injunctions and damages but would also be compelled to report these concerns to the relevant county animal welfare authorities and zoning enforcement. This was a declaration of war. She wasn't just trying to fine me over a fence anymore, she was trying to destroy my dream, to drive me out by making my life untenable, by threatening me with the involvement of serious county agencies based on lies. I sat there, reading and rereading the letter, a cold fury building inside me. This wasn't just about Brenda's power trip anymore, this was malicious. She was manufacturing offenses, twisting reality to fit her narrative of me as a problem resident. I immediately called Michael. I read him excerpts from the letter, my voice shaking with anger. She's accusing me of running an illegal business and hinting at animal neglect, Michael. Based on nothing. My chickens. My vegetable patch. Michael listened, and I could almost hear him grinding his teeth over the phone. Okay, Mom. This is a serious escalation. She's making defamatory statements now, in writing. This isn't just about HOA bylaws, this is character assassination. What do I do? I asked, feeling the fight drain out of me for a moment, replaced by a weary sense of being under siege. We fight back harder, he said, his voice firm and reassuring. First, you draft a detailed, point-by-point rebuttal to every single accusation in that letter. Be factual, be calm, but be firm. Deny every false claim. State clearly that your chickens are for personal use, your garden is a hobby, and your animals are well cared for. Include photos of the chickens, their coop, the garden. Show them how ridiculous her claims are. Send it to this new law firm, and copy Brenda and the entire HOA board, if you can get their addresses. He paused. And Mom, I think it's time you considered talking to a lawyer yourself. Not just to defend against her, but to explore options for a harassment suit against Brenda and potentially the HOA if the board is complicit in her actions. A lawyer. The thought was daunting, another expense I hadn't budgeted for. But Michael was right. Brenda was crossing lines that had serious legal implications. I also think, Michael continued, his voice dropping slightly, you should be prepared for her to try something else. She's cornered now. She's made these big threats, and when your rebuttal shows them to be baseless, she might do something desperate to try and create evidence for her claims. His words were prophetic. I spent the next 2 days meticulously crafting my response. I took photos of my 6 placid hens enjoying their spacious, clean run. I took photos of my modest vegetable garden, clearly a hobbyist's endeavor. I even included a photo of Daisy, my little terrier mix, curled up on her comfy bed, the picture of a cherished pet. I detailed my daily animal care routine. I addressed every single one of Brenda's accusations with calm, factual rebuttals, referencing the actual, or lack of, HOA bylaws pertaining to such things. I pointed out that unconfirmed reports were not evidence and that her insinuations were baseless and defamatory. I sent the package via certified mail to the new lawyers, to Brenda, and after a bit of sleuthing online, to the addresses I could find for the other 4 HOA board members. I wanted them to see exactly what their president was up to. For a few days, there was an unnerving silence. No new letters, no drive-bys from Brenda. It was the calm before the storm. I busied myself with ranch chores, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, but there was a knot of tension in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I kept my phone charged and nearby. I checked the feed from my security cameras more often than usual. I knew Brenda wouldn't just let this go. She had too much ego invested. Her grand accusations had been challenged, her authority questioned directly and in writing to her entire board. She was going to retaliate, and I had a sinking feeling it wouldn't be with another letter. She was going to try and create a situation, a spectacle, something she could point to as proof that she was right all along. I just didn't know when, or how. But I was as ready as I could be. My Brenda Chronicles folder was now thick with evidence, my resolve hardened by her escalating malice. This had to end, and I was determined it wouldn't end with me packing my bags. The storm broke on a Thursday afternoon. It was a beautiful day, ironically. Sunny, a light breeze, the kind of day that usually made my heart sing. I was out in the small pasture near the barn, checking the new fence line one last time before I made arrangements to finally bring home a couple of gentle rescue goats I'd found. I was feeling cautiously optimistic. My rebuttal letter had been delivered a few days prior, and perhaps, just perhaps, it had given Brenda and her lawyers pause. Maybe they'd realized they had no real case. Wishful thinking, as it turned out. I heard a car door slam, not from my driveway, but from the direction of the road, followed by a woman's voice, raised in what sounded like distress, but with an underlying theatrical quality I recognized all too well. Help! Somebody help me! I'm being threatened. She's out of control. It was Brenda. My blood ran cold. I peered through the trees and saw her standing just on her side of my property line, near the road, clutching her phone, looking wildly around as if expecting an imminent attack. There was no one near her. I was a good 50 yards away, inside my own fence, armed with nothing more dangerous than a pair of fencing pliers. This was it. This was her play. She was manufacturing a confrontation, a crisis. I immediately pulled out my own phone and hit record on the video camera, angling it towards her through the trees as best I could. I didn't move towards her, I didn't speak. I just recorded. She paced back and forth for a moment, then seemed to spot me. Her voice ratcheted up another notch. There she is. That woman. She threatened me. She said she'd let her vicious animals loose on me if I didn't leave her alone. I'm an HOA president just trying to do my duty, and she's threatening my life. Vicious animals. I had Daisy, who weighed all of 15 pounds and whose most vicious act was enthusiastic licking, and 6 chickens. The goats weren't even here yet. The absurdity was breathtaking, but the malice behind it was chilling. She was creating a narrative for a 911 call, painting me as a dangerous, unhinged individual. And then, as if on cue, she dramatically brought her phone to her ear. Yes, 911. I need help immediately. I'm at my address, and the resident here, Sarah Miller, is threatening me. She's very agitated. I'm afraid of what she might do. Please send officers right away. She was good, I had to give her that. Her voice dripped with feigned terror. Anyone listening to that call would think she was in genuine peril. I stayed where I was, phone still recording. My heart was hammering, but my mind was surprisingly clear. Michael's advice echoed in my ears: stay calm. Document everything. She might do something desperate to create evidence. This was that desperate act. I could hear the distant wail of a siren approaching. Fast. Brenda must have called them just before she started her performance. She continued her charade, glancing nervously towards me, then back at the road, wringing her hands. Oh, thank goodness, I think I hear them. Please hurry, she stage whispered into her phone, loud enough for me to hear. A county sheriff's patrol car, lights flashing, pulled up sharply on the road. Not just one, but 2 cars this time. 4 deputies. Brenda had clearly emphasized the threat level. As the first deputy got out, Brenda rushed towards him, a picture of distress. Oh, officer, thank heavens. That woman there, she pointed dramatically at me, still standing quietly by my fence line, she threatened to harm me. She's been nothing but trouble since she moved in, violating all the rules, and now she's resorting to threats of violence. I saw one of the deputies, a younger man with dark hair, look from Brenda to me, then back to Brenda. He had a very neutral, almost unreadable expression. He wasn't one of the deputies who had come out before. In fact, as he turned his head slightly, I saw his profile. My breath caught in my chest. It couldn't be. Could it? The deputy who had been listening to Brenda's tirade then turned and started walking towards my fence line. The other 3 deputies were fanning out slightly, observing. As he got closer, my heart did a somersault. It was Michael. My son, Michael. In his uniform, on duty, responding to Brenda Higgins' hysterical, fabricated 911 call about me. Brenda, still babbling to the other deputy, hadn't recognized him yet, or if she had, hadn't made the connection. She was too caught up in her own drama. Michael reached the fence. He looked at me, his expression utterly professional, betraying nothing. Ma'am, he said, his voice calm and official, I'm Officer Miller. We received a distress call. Can you tell me what's happening here? Officer Miller. He used his last name. My last name. The irony was so thick you could spread it on toast. I took a deep breath, my video still recording, pointed discreetly downwards now but still capturing audio. Officer, I said, my voice steady, there is no distress here on my part. Ms. Higgins, over there, seems to be manufacturing a situation. She walked onto the edge of my property line, started shouting accusations, and then called 911 claiming I threatened her. I have done no such thing. I have been on my own property, minding my own business. I believe this is a retaliatory action related to ongoing disputes I have with her as the HOA president, about which I have extensive documentation, including her previous false report to the police. Michael nodded slowly. Do you have any recording of this incident, ma'am? He asked, still in that formal tone. Yes, officer, I do, I replied, holding up my phone slightly. I started recording when I heard her begin shouting. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Brenda watching us, a smug little smirk playing on her lips. She thought she had me. She thought the cavalry had arrived to validate her victimhood and punish me. Oh, how wrong she was. The expression on her face when she finally realized who Officer Miller was going to be absolutely priceless. This was a moment I wouldn't have dared script, yet here it was, unfolding in real time. The tables were about to turn, and Brenda Higgins had no idea she was the one walking into the trap. Michael maintained his professional composure, a skill he'd honed over years on the force. All right, ma'am. If you could just stay right there for a moment, he then turned and walked back towards Brenda and the other deputies, who were still listening to her increasingly agitated version of events. I watched, my own phone still discreetly recording. This was unfolding better than any revenge fantasy I could have cooked up. Okay, Miss Higgins, Michael said, his voice carrying clearly. I've spoken with Mrs. Miller. She states that she made no threats and that you initiated this. She also states she has a recording of the incident, Brenda scoffed. Of course, she'd say that. She's lying. She's trying to intimidate me. I am the victim here. I demand you arrest her for threatening an officer of the Homeowners Association. She was really laying it on thick, appealing to their authority, trying to frame herself as some kind of official being assaulted in the line of duty. One of the other deputies, an older, more seasoned-looking sergeant, spoke up. Ma'am, being an HOA president doesn't make you a sworn officer. Let's just try and get to the bottom of what happened, Michael then said, his voice still calm. Miss Higgins, did you identify yourself to the 911 dispatcher when you called? Yes, of course, I did. Brenda snapped. I told them who I was and that I was being threatened by that woman. And you're certain Mrs. Miller threatened you with physical harm or with her animals? Michael pressed. Absolutely. Brenda declared, puffing herself up. She was screaming at me. Said she'd set her dogs on me. It was terrifying. Her dogs. Plural. Daisy was my only dog, and she was probably asleep on the porch. The lies were just piling up. Michael exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance with the sergeant. Ms. Higgins, Michael said, his tone shifting just a fraction, becoming a little more pointed. Filing a false police report is a serious offense. It's a waste of county resources, and it can have severe legal consequences. Are you absolutely certain about your statement? Because Mrs. Miller also alleges a pattern of harassment from you, including a previous baseless call to the police. Brenda's eyes narrowed. She didn't like being questioned. She was used to being the one in charge, the one making accusations, not answering them. Are you doubting me, officer? She demanded, her voice rising. I am a respected member of this community. She's the troublemaker. Just look at the state of her property. It's a disgrace. This was the moment. Michael took a small step closer to her. Ms. Higgins, he said, his voice now devoid of any warmth, all business. My name is Officer Michael Miller. Sarah Miller is my mother. The silence that followed was stunning. Brenda's jaw, which had been set in a belligerent line, literally dropped. Her eyes widened, darting from Michael's face to mine, then back to Michael's badge, as if trying to process an impossible equation. The color drained from her face, leaving her with a pasty, shocked pallor. The smugness vanished, replaced by a dawning horror. Your mother, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Yes, ma'am, Michael confirmed. And I have to say, Ms. Higgins, I've heard quite a bit about your interactions with my mother over the past few months. Including numerous unsubstantiated violation notices, threats, and what appears to be a concerted campaign of harassment. The other deputies were now watching Brenda intently, their expressions shifting from neutral to something more critical. They'd likely heard snippets of HOA disputes before, but this was different. This had the distinct smell of a personal vendetta spectacularly backfiring. Now, Michael continued, his voice like ice, we have a situation here where you've called 911, claiming you were threatened. My mother, the person you accused, denies this and has video evidence. You, on the other hand, have a documented history of making complaints against her, some of which have already been determined to be unfounded by this department. Brenda started to sputter. I didn't know. I mean, she was being aggressive, her bravado was crumbling fast. Aggressive how, Ms. Higgins? Michael pressed. Was she yelling? Did she advance on you? Did she threaten you before you started shouting for help and calling 911? Brenda looked like a cornered animal. Well, her demeanor, it was very hostile. Hostile demeanor isn't a criminal threat, Ms. Higgins, the sergeant interjected dryly. Especially if you were, as Mrs. Miller claims, on or near her property line making accusations. I decided it was time to present my evidence. Officers, I called out, walking calmly to my fence line, phone in hand. Perhaps you'd like to see my recording. It starts from the moment I heard Ms. Higgins begin shouting. You can clearly hear her making these accusations before I say a single word. You can also see I am a considerable distance away from her, on my own property. Michael nodded to one of the other deputies. Officer Davies, please take a look at Mrs. Miller's recording. Officer Davies came over, and I played the video. It clearly showed Brenda's theatrical performance, her shouts, her call to 911, all while I was silently standing far off. There was no sound from me until Michael approached the fence. After watching it, Officer Davies looked at the sergeant and shook his head slightly. The sergeant's expression hardened. He turned to Brenda. "Ms. Higgins, based on the evidence presented by Mrs. Miller, and your own admission that you called 911, it appears there may be probable cause to believe you knowingly filed a false police report concerning Mrs. Miller." "That is a misdemeanor offense," Brenda gasped, clutching her chest dramatically. "No. I was scared. I genuinely felt threatened." "Your video, Mrs. Miller," Michael asked me, "does it show Ms. Higgins on your property at any point before she made the call?" "It shows her right at the edge, possibly stepping over the unmarked line while she was gesticulating," I said. "And my security cameras likely caught her approach to my property line." Brenda then made her fatal mistake. Perhaps in a last-ditch effort to regain control, or perhaps out of sheer panic, she lunged towards Officer Davies, who still held my phone. "Give me that. That's doctored evidence," she shrieked, trying to snatch the phone. "Whoa, ma'am," Officer Davies said, easily sidestepping her and shielding my phone. Michael and the sergeant immediately moved in. "Miss Higgins, step back," Michael commanded, his voice sharp. "You do not interfere with officers, and you certainly do not attempt to grab evidence." But Brenda was beyond reason. She flailed, trying to push past Michael. "You're all against me. This is a conspiracy because he's her son." That was it. The sergeant had seen enough. "Brenda Higgins," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "You are under arrest for filing a false police report and for interfering with a police officer." He reached for his handcuffs. Brenda froze, her eyes wide with utter disbelief. "Arrest me." The click of the handcuffs as the sergeant secured her wrists behind her back was one of the most satisfying sounds I had ever heard. Brenda Higgins, HOA president, scourge of my ranch, was actually being arrested. On my property. By officers she had called, one of whom was my son. The irony was so potent, so deeply satisfying, it was almost overwhelming. She looked utterly defeated, her perfectly coiffed hair now slightly askew, her expensive linen slacks looking ridiculous on a woman in handcuffs. As they led her towards one of the patrol cars, a sputtering, protesting mess, Michael caught my eye. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. No words were needed. Justice, it seemed, had a badge, and today, it also had a very personal stake in the matter. The aftermath of Brenda's arrest was swift and, for me, incredibly gratifying. As she was driven away in the back of the patrol car, still protesting her innocence and threatening to sue everyone in sight, a profound sense of relief washed over me. It was as if a heavy weight I hadn't even fully realized I was carrying had been lifted. The remaining deputies, including Michael, were meticulously professional. They took my full statement, a copy of my video recording, and documented the information from my security cameras which clearly showed Brenda approaching my property alone and initiating her theatrical display. The sergeant assured me that a full report would be filed, and that the district attorney's office would review the charges against Brenda, filing a false police report and resisting or obstructing an officer. "Given the evidence, Mrs. Miller," the sergeant said before he left, "especially your video and her actions here today, I'd say Ms. Higgins is in a fair bit of trouble. We don't take kindly to our resources being abused like this, or to our officers being obstructed." Michael stayed for a few minutes after the others had left, officially to ensure I was all right and to give me information on victim/witness procedures, but unofficially, I think, just to share a quiet moment of victory. "You okay, Mom?" he asked, his official demeanor finally softening as he stepped fully onto my property, no longer separated by the fence line of duty. I let out a shaky laugh. "Okay, Michael, I'm fantastic. I feel like I can finally breathe again." I gave him a fierce hug. "Thank you. I know you were just doing your job, but, thank you." He hugged me back. "She made her own bed, Mom. All I did was provide the linen service." He grinned, then quickly became serious again. "This isn't entirely over, you know. She'll have her day in court. And you'll likely need to testify." "I'll be there with bells on," I said without hesitation. And with my Brenda Chronicles folder. News of Brenda's arrest spread through Meadowview Ranch estates like wildfire. It turned out Mr. Henderson, my elderly neighbor, had been out in his garden and witnessed the whole thing from a distance. He was, by all accounts, delighted. Within days, an emergency HOA board meeting was called. I wasn't invited, of course, but I heard all about it later from another board member, a quiet woman named Carol, who had always seemed uncomfortable with Brenda's aggressive tactics. Apparently, Brenda, out on bail, had tried to play the victim, claiming a misunderstanding and police overreach, even hinting at a conspiracy orchestrated by me and my son. But my detailed rebuttal letter to her accusations, which I had copied to all board members, combined with the undeniable fact of her arrest for filing a false report against me, was too much even for the more Brenda-aligned members to ignore. Carol told me that my documentation, particularly the photos and the calm, factual way I had refuted Brenda's claims, had been very persuasive. When confronted with the evidence and the potential legal and financial liability Brenda was now exposing the HOA to, the board did the only sensible thing. They voted to immediately suspend Brenda Higgins from her position as president, pending the outcome of her legal case and an internal review of her conduct. They also, significantly, voted to withdraw all fines related to my fence and to formally acknowledge that my fence, chickens, and garden were, in fact, compliant with all reasonable interpretations of the bylaws. It was a complete capitulation, a total victory. A few weeks later, Brenda Higgins, on the advice of her lawyer, pleaded no contest to the charge of filing a false police report. The obstruction charge was dropped as part of the plea. She received a hefty fine, a period of probation, and was ordered to attend an anger management course. Perhaps more humiliating for her, the story made the local paper, a small article under Community News, detailing the arrest of an HOA president for misusing police resources. Her reign of terror was officially over. The HOA subsequently held new elections, and to my surprise, Carol, the quiet board member, was nominated and elected as the new president. One of her first actions was to send me a formal letter of apology on behalf of the HOA for the distress and harassment I had endured. She also initiated a review of many of the more ambiguously worded bylaws, aiming to make them clearer and less open to subjective, punitive interpretation. Life on the ranch returned to the peaceful rhythm I had first envisioned. I finally got my rescue goats, two sweet-natured girls I named Thelma and Louise, and they happily explored their new pasture behind their sturdy, Brenda-defying fence. My chickens continued to lay delicious eggs, my garden thrived, and Daisy chased squirrels with joyful abandon. The air no longer felt thick with tension. I could hammer a nail, paint a railing, or simply sit on my porch with a cup of coffee without looking over my shoulder. Michael still came out on weekends, not as a potential responding officer, but just as my son, to help with chores, share a meal, and enjoy the peace of the place with me. We'd sometimes talk about the whole Brenda affair, and we'd always end up shaking our heads and chuckling at the sheer, poetic justice of it all. The day Brenda was arrested, the image of her face when Michael identified himself, the satisfying click of those handcuffs, it became a cherished family anecdote, a testament to standing your ground and the unexpected ways justice can be served. I learned a lot from that experience. I learned about the importance of knowing your rights, of meticulous documentation, and of not backing down when you know you're in the right, even when faced with seemingly overwhelming opposition. I also learned that sometimes, the universe has a funny way of delivering karma, occasionally with a badge and a very personal connection. My little slice of heaven was truly heaven again. And every time I looked at my beautiful, sturdy fence, I couldn't help but smile. It wasn't just a fence, it was a monument to resilience, a boundary not just for my property, but a boundary that Brenda Higgins had crossed, much to her eventual, and very public, regret. And you know what? Those heritage white railings I eventually painted. They looked absolutely perfect.